Welcome to the Magical Mystery Trip. I'm Ben Fong Torres. The Beatles always enjoyed making movies as well as music. In the mid-60s, well before camcorders, all they had were 8mm home movie cameras, but they made the most of them. What you're about to see is the only private home movie footage of the Beatles ever made available to the public, and on a limited edition basis at that. They came from the estate of Mel Evans, close confidant, road manager, and even occasional backup voice in Beatles sessions. The footage was shot by both Mel and Paul McCartney, and being home movies will be unsteady at times. But they provide glimpses of everyday life and of Paul's vacations in Los Angeles, Denver, Spain, and Africa. We also go on location for the Beatles' TV film Magical Mystery Tour. It was broadcast originally in black and white in December of 1967 in England. It got mixed reviews, but they improved when the film was shown again in color. You'll see never-before-released, behind-the-scenes footage shot on the west coast of England. But we begin with Paul and Mel en route to Denver. It's April 1967, and Paul is preparing to fly from San Francisco to Denver in a Learjet belonging to NBC News. It was Beatles manager Brian Epstein who arranged to get Paul and Mel on board. Before takeoff, Paul captures Mel on film. But it's Paul that the camera and most people seek out, and he accommodates his fellow passengers. Paul is winging his way to Colorado to see his girlfriend, the actress Jane Asher. They had met in 1963. Now, she was the Bristol Old Vics leading ingenue touring with the troupe in its production of Romeo and Juliet. On arrival in Denver, Paul shows off some of the fashion of the day. Then, spotting a liftoff, he puts his movie camera right to work and grabs a last shot of the Learjet. The Beatles had worked nearly 4 months recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a title, by the way, credited to Paul and Mel. While John drove his Rolls-Royce to Surrey to a coach company which would paint it in psychedelic colors, Paul had come to the United States, stopping first in San Francisco, where he visited the Haight-Ashbury and met members of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. It's Jane's 21st birthday, and Paul, who would present her an engagement ring that December, had promised to celebrate with her. He would attend a performance of Romeo and Juliet and lead the audience in a standing ovation. Jane had been acting since age 5, and her career ambitions, along with an episode in which she found Paul with another woman, would lead to a breakup in 1968. But for now, they were, in the eyes of Beatle fans, the perfect couple. In the Rocky Mountains outside Denver, Paul captures the surrounding beauty, including Jane, and, well, why not, his own feet. But a Beatle is rarely alone. Even while he's having his mini-vacation with Jane, Paul is tracked by Mel Evans. Actually, it's one of his jobs. Mel, who met the Beatles in 1961 at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, where he was a bouncer, is the Beatles' bodyguard as well as their road manager. On his way over from London, Paul came up with the idea of a TV film he might direct himself. Now he's getting in a little practice behind the camera. In Denver, Paul aimed his camera at anything that either moved or didn't. Where he and Jane stayed, a surprisingly modest motel probably booked by the Old Vic for her, and the surrounding neighborhood. Derek Taylor, the Beatles' publicist, told me that all the Beatles loved the latest gadgets. Paul was clearly inseparable from his. While a yellow cabbie drove, Paul continued his cinematic explorations around town. In most of his visits to America as a Beatle, Paul had seen little more than airports, auditoriums, and stadiums, and hotel rooms, of course. As he told me once, it's like any kind of tour, you just scoot through. You see the hall you're playing in and a little of the outside scenery, unless you stay for a while. Tours get to be a bit of a blur. At an early press conference with the Beatles, someone asked, "What do you do when you're cooped up in a hotel room between shows?" And George Harrison responded, "We ice skate." Anyway, this visit with Jane was a rare opportunity for Paul to see and capture the sights of a typical American city. Paul lapped up everything his camera could get into focus, from architecture to things he found amusing. Outdoor signs, cornball decorations, garish outsized advertising, things Americans had taken for granted, but which to him were still novel. In their 3-day visit, Paul and Jane visited the Red Rocks Amphitheater. For Paul, it was a homecoming of sorts. The Beatles played there in the summer of 1964 at one early height of Beatlemania, to 9,000 screaming fans, many of them pelting the stage with jelly beans. After Paul showed Jane around, they parted ways, Jane continuing on her 3-month tour with the Old Vic Company, and Paul opening himself up to the world capital of movie-making itself. Although Paul was supposed to be on vacation, he stayed busy in Los Angeles. He visited a Beach Boys recording session and helped produce the song Vegetables. Paul has been quoted saying that he wrote Here, There, and Everywhere with the Beach Boys in mind. But of course the Beatles performed the song with John and George playing Beach Boys in June of 1966 for their album Revolver. Paul and Mel stayed with Derek Taylor, who'd been the Beatles' publicist in London and now lived with his wife Joan and their 2 daughters in the Hollywood Hills. Derek now represented the cream of Los Angeles pop groups, and he invited Paul to join the board of directors of the upcoming Monterey Pop Festival. Derek is grateful that Paul had his movie camera with him. His own films during these times were stolen years later when someone broke into his car, thinking it carried films of the Beatles. Now Derek has happily added this footage to his family archives. Neither Derek nor Paul was dressed for poolside lounging, but you can see that Paul's been to Carnaby Row in London and that he's a dedicated follower of fashion. Well, Derek Taylor booked a babysitter, and he and Paul drove off to check out the new Century City complex just past Beverly Hills, where prices, of course, are always reasonable. In public, Derek remembers Paul was at ease, but he moved very quickly so that people might see him, but before they had much time to do anything about it, he was gone. Once settled somewhere, he found it easy to relax, and after browsing, he and Derek slipped into a bar for a cocktail. After agreeing to join the Monterey Pop Festival board, Paul was off to London. On the aircraft, he began sketching out specific ideas, even for songs and cast members for his TV film. Something about a mystery tour.